So during our testing of Panther Lake laptops, something happened that we have never experienced in the last 15 years of testing laptops here at Hardware Canucks. So the ZenBook Duo and the IdeaPad Pro 5, both of which have Intel's Core Ultra 3 series, are still going with their battery life tests, as you can see. Days and days after we thought that they would finish. That means that they are getting record-breaking battery life. So how long did they actually last? Well, we're gonna have to film that part of the video, I guess, maybe a day from now. But let's see what the results actually were. All right, so Future Mike here, and the numbers are in, and they're absolutely mind-blowing, incredible, record-setting even. But I do have to preface this whole section by mentioning one thing. Both of these laptops that we're testing, the IdeaPad and the ZenBook Duo, have two of the biggest battery capacities that we've ever seen on a thin and light laptop, 99.9 watt hours for both of them. So yes, that does give them a serious leg up over all the competition that we're going to be showing here, but I will be sort of like evening that out a little bit later. Anyways, our regular web browsing test hit a ridiculous 30.5 hours on the IdeaPad and more than 24 on the ZenBook Duo, and both blew everything else out of the water, even the Macbook Pro and Snapdragon laptops. To put this into context, if you're using these things for 8 hours straight per day, the IdeaPad would have almost 4 days of battery life, while the ZenBook would have just over 3 days. Moving on to streaming, and it's a whole different ballgame, with the Panther Lake laptop numbers actually being sort of turned upside down. The IdeaPad is still really good, but the ZenBook falls flat on its face when you consider it's using a 99 watt hour battery. This really does highlight how there can be sometimes a huge delta between systems with otherwise identical specs. And look, as we move on to local video, this is another area where Apple's integrated media engine is clearly superior in terms of battery use. The Qualcomm processor did pretty good here too, though again, the two Ultra X9s were clearly the best x86 based laptops we've ever tested here. I also need to mention AMD because it's pretty evident that when compared to current low wattage Intel models, their processors really suffer in the battery life department, and that won't change anytime soon, since their upcoming Ryzen AI 400 series is nothing more than a rebrand of the 300 series with some slightly higher frequencies here and there. So yeah, those numbers, they absolutely positively make Panther Lake look very, very impressive. But like I mentioned before, there is some inherent bias here because both of those laptops have absolutely titanic battery capacities compared to everything else. So we really wanted to level the playing field, so to speak. What did we do? So what we did is we calculated how many minutes each of these laptops got for battery time versus their battery capacities. And the results turned completely upside down because it's evident that the two Panther Lake devices are using their massive 99 watt hour batteries as a sort of crutch to get super long times away from a plug. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it does absolutely inflate Panther Lake's abilities here. So now, sure, the IdeaPad might still be ahead, but that 288V system shows itself to be even more efficient than the ZenBook Duo's Ultra X9, while the M5 and Snapdragon aren't actually that far behind either. Then with streaming video, the M5 just shoots way far ahead, while the ZenBook Duo is again beaten by the Lunar Lake and Snapdragon systems. The IdeaPad does well, but that massive battery was evidently propping up its overall numbers. And then in our final test with local video playback, well, Panther Lake, it doesn't look like all that much of an improvement over Lunar Lake. If anything, it might actually be a pretty big regression when watching a video locally, but still, Apple and Qualcomm processors are simply unbeatable here. I think the jury is still out when it comes to how good or how maybe disappointing Panther Lake is on the battery life front. If anything, I think these results, they really do prove that battery life will probably be more determined by the devices being benchmarked versus the architecture itself. But anyways, I guess I'm gonna have to get us back to current day Mike with the rest of this review. So let's go. So at least now you know how good or bad both of these laptops did in the overall battery life testing. And from my perspective here, they're gonna do pretty good. But anyways, before we get into all of the testing, I did want to mention a few things here and put things into a bit more of a perspective, because both of these systems that were sent to us by ASUS and Intel, well, they might actually inflate your perspective about the platform itself. The first reason being is that they both have the X9 388H chip, which is at the very peak of Intel's lineup. It combines 16 cores spread through performance, efficiency, and low power E cores without any hyperthreading, alongside Intel's biggest, highest performance integrated graphics so far. This thing uses the new Xe3 architecture with 12 cores, which is huge when you consider Lunar Lake maxed out at just 8 cores on the previous generation Xe2 design. Basically, the X9 388H is meant to sit, like I said, at the very top of Intel's new lineup. So it'll combine the most cores, the highest clocks, and the biggest GPU core. But one of the most important factors here for any laptop processor is its power envelope. And that's where Panther Lake offers basically something for everyone. It can scale from just 25 watts, so for the ultra slim and light market, all the way up to 80 watts on higher end parts in sustained workloads, and even more than that in short bursts. And that massive power range, it also sort of like muddies the water a little bit when it comes to testing laptop CPUs. Because look, what we wanted to do for this review and the way that we set it up is we wanted to focus on the thin and light market. So with devices that range from about 30 watts to maybe a little bit higher. And what was sent here is very different from that. On one hand, you have the ZenBook Duo, which is that 30 watt to 45 watt standpoint where a lot of thin and lights typically live. Meanwhile, we did have to disqualify the IdeaPad Pro 5 because of its overall wattage and a few other reasons too. And I know you might be sort of like rage commenting right now, but hear me out, guys. Other than the fact that the IdeaPad came a little bit too late to complete all of our testing, it's a very different beast from all the other laptops that we're testing here. Not only is it thicker and heavier and uses a 16-inch screen, but it's also set to use exponentially more power too. None of the devices we're using as comparison even got close, which would lead to a vastly inflated perspective of Panther Lake's relative performance if we didn't take power into this equation. So it'll get a separate review where it can compete against its peers at similar power levels. And remove that outlier with the IdeaPad Pro 5 being completely eliminated here, and things start to align a lot better. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about here is, of course, the integrated graphics, because this is one of the biggest things that people have been talking about in all of the comment threads that we've seen so far. And yes, it does absolutely bring with it a whole new level of performance to integrated graphics. And look, unfortunately, while we tried to align platform power as best we could, the amount of juice that's directed towards the integrated GPUs is literally all over the place. Naturally, at those higher onboard performance presets, the bigger IGP in Panther Lake takes more power, but at its 17 watt setting, it's pretty equal to all the other competitors here. The only exception to that is the VivoBook S14's 365, which gobbles down an almost titanic 40 watts just dedicated towards its graphics subsystem. Let's start off with CS2, and what Intel has done here is pretty incredible, especially against AMD. When the HX 370 and 388H are running at almost identical wattages, the Intel CPU wins by just over 42%. Meanwhile, the increases against previous generation CPUs are just as impressive. Even the 38 watt 880M is like a distant speck in the rearview mirror here. Other esports games follow the same trend, with the B390 showing some really good improvements over Lunar Lake's 140V. And I think the biggest accomplishment here is what Intel has been able to accomplish again against AMD. Things get even crazier in Rainbow Six, with the 388H offering almost double the performance of some of last year's best integrated graphics in both averages and 1% lows. Baldur's Gate is a historically CPU-bound title, and even here the new Intel CPUs have a pretty commanding lead, with the higher wattage setting being the first integrated graphics besides Strix Halo to break 60 frames per second in this game. The same goes for Cyberpunk. Intel's latest drivers did boost performance for Lunar Lake, and now Panther Lake, of course, it benefits too. It just runs away with things, even without upscaling being factored into the equation. But add upscaling to that equation through XeSS or FSR for AMD and Snapdragon, and frame rates increase again right across the board for every GPU here. And yet there's obviously a few areas where Intel still needs some work on their drivers, and Dota 2 is one of them. I mean, sure, this game is CPU limited, and the 388H delivers more than 200 frames per second at both power levels, but those 1% lows should get a bit better as time goes on. PUBG is another one where the 99th percentile frame times suffer just a bit, even though Panther Lake's averages are still very, very strong. And I think these results, they really do speak for themselves. Intel's goal here was to make the best integrated graphics for thin and light, and that is exactly what they've accomplished. It's basically a quantum leap forward versus where they were just like a year ago. And there's something to say about that, right? And AMD, I think they've really been put on notice here. But something else that's really impressive is how those better integrated graphics translate into some real tangible benefits for real-world creator workloads too. Like in Blender, where this thing manages to cut the 288V's rendering time in half and come within spitting distance of Apple's insanely capable M5. Meanwhile, Intel's integrated media processing engine also got a complete overhaul, and as a result, the Ultra X9 388H becomes the fastest x86-based SoC we've tested, and it beats CPUs that chug back a hell of a lot more power too. The only thing that manages to beat it is, again, the M5. And look, there's no denying Apple's ecosystem supremacy in some apps. Their optimization stack is just unbeatable. So there's some apps where the MacBook Pro just destroys the competition. It's not even close. But in the overall context of things, even at its lowest wattage, the ZenBook Duo with Panther Lake got the best numbers we've ever seen on a thin and light Windows device. And in Premiere, the results were completely shocking to me. This thing actually matched the M5 MacBook Pro while just dominating all the other laptop processors here. The other thing we have to talk about, and yes, this is not like an application stack that is broadly used on thin and light laptops, but full core workloads were something that Lunar Lake always struggled with in the grand scheme of things, right? Because even though it had an improved architecture, it topped out at just 8 cores and 8 threads. While we still don't have that hyperthreading here, we're now talking about 16 cores. And sure, yes, 4 of those cores are those low performance LPE cores, but they still stack up to have something here that is a heck of a lot more capable than the previous generation. But I do have to start things off here by throwing a little bit of a bucket of cold water on this whole situation, because the word stagnation pops into my mind when looking at the single core results. I mean, sure, CPUs for the Windows ecosystem have been making incremental progress, but they're way, way far behind what Apple's managed to do with their silicon. But move into performance in heavily multi-threaded workloads and things do change. Naturally, with its massive thread advantage, the 388H just like steamrolls the 288V. But that really wasn't a surprise, was it? What was pretty eye-opening to me though was how well it did against the 285H, which also has 16 cores and consumes 30 watts more here. And remember, that's based off of the Arrow Lake architecture, Intel's previous generation flagship CPU. And now this might not sound like a huge accomplishment if you approach this from a desktop perspective. But look, from a laptop perspective, where these devices are constantly having this internal battle between power, frequencies, noise, surface temperatures, and all the other factors, 13 watts is absolutely almost mind-blowingly massive. The results in Blender are similar too, though we can obviously see that AMD's approach with 12 cores and 24 threads will sometimes lead to a distinct advantage, even at just 30 watts. But on the flip side of that equation, throwing more power at Zen 5 seems to have a very minimal impact, whereas Panther Lake seems to respond really well. Handbrake shows pretty much the same thing. Titanic benefits over Lunar Lake, good uplifts against Arrow Lake, and matching or slightly beating higher-end Ryzen AI series chips. The same thing can be said about how it competes against the Apple M5 and Snapdragon X1 Elite. But get into those mixed workloads that also start hitting the memory and storage subsystems a little bit more, and these processors, yes, they do really well against their predecessors and AMD systems, but they simply can't compete against what Apple's offering here. Their entire top to bottom ecosystem, from the hardware to its natively supported apps, is just so damn well optimized, especially for the Adobe software stack. Competing with that, well, it just becomes impossible for Windows machines. Panther Lake, yes, it does make some inroads, but remember, this is Apple's entry-level M5 competing against the best that Intel has to offer right now. And look, yes, that is exactly what you get when you have a single set of hardware to optimize your ecosystem for. And I know a lot of people were hoping for the exact same thing with Windows on ARM. There's very much only a single hardware stack that Microsoft needed to optimize for. People were hoping that they would go very heavy on the optimizations and light on the fluff. And unfortunately, they got the exact opposite with Windows on ARM. But look, speaking of optimizations, something else I needed to talk about here is how well these processors do, at least on the performance front, when they're running under battery. Anyways, in Cinebench, where Panther Lake was pretty far ahead in its highest performance mode, we're seeing less than a 10% reduction when running on battery, which is a heck of a lot better than the 285H. Handbrake, on the other hand, was another win for the 388H when plugged in. And even when unplugged, it was the best CPU of the bunch here. But again, the M5, HX370, and 288V all posted really good results due to their lower power bands. Our Photoshop results weren't exactly the best achievement for Panther Lake, not by a long shot, when the systems were plugged in, but yank that charger and it retains the majority of its performance, at least on the ZenBook Duo. The only thing that's better here is the M5. Alright, so now that the dust has settled here over multiple days of shooting and almost 2 weeks of testing, what is my opinion about Panther Lake? I think it's mission accomplished for Intel. On the positive side, yes, battery life seems to be very, very good. There's better multi-core performance than last year's flagship 285H and at much lower power levels too. The gaming numbers are almost unheard of in the thin and light laptop market, and those must have AMD worried. Meanwhile, there's some professional app numbers that can sometimes rival Apple's M5. And the list goes on and on, right? I mean, sure, there are some things that I still have questions about. Like, does it really beat Lunar Lake in battery life in a true apples to apples comparison? Well, like I said before, the jury is still out on that one, mostly because the Asus ZenBook numbers were all over the place, while the IdeaPads were, well, pretty amazing by comparison. Also, and I have to mention this, pricing is a huge concern of mine, and it should be for you too if you're looking at any of these 2026 thin and light laptops. And look, the ZenBook Duo is an absolutely positively terrible barometer for the thin and light laptop market, right? Because this thing is a niche device with features that most people aren't even looking for and don't even need. With that being said, the 2026 version is, listen to this, $600 in the United States more than it was for the 2025 model. And make no mistake about it, MacBooks are a huge contender when it comes to battery life, their software stack, and most of all, believe it or not, pricing too. Because for a comparable device like the XPS 14, and this thing doesn't even come with the Ultra X9 388H we use for our benchmarks here, you'll be paying at least MacBook Pro prices. And for a Windows laptop, that's a huge problem. So in a lot of ways, Intel has absolutely done something special with Panther Lake. This is exactly what we needed for the thin and light laptop market in 2026. Better battery life, better GPUs, enhanced multi-core performance, you name it. The only thing that I would say here is you got to take a wait and see approach about where things ultimately land throughout the rest of this year before jumping on the Panther Lake bandwagon, because we're only getting a very, very small sliver here of what this platform can and can't accomplish. We ultimately need to review more of these devices to see if they're as good as these initial devices sort of make them out to be. The other thing we can't forget is that Qualcomm, AMD, and yes, maybe even Nvidia have competing products that are coming out potentially later this year, or maybe a little bit earlier than a lot of us might think. But until that happens, look, Intel needs a ton of credit here, especially when you consider how poorly things were going last year and to a lesser extent the year before. But anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will definitely see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.